Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for this session. My name is John Kellewert. I think I might have communicated with all of you at some point over the past couple of weeks or months. I'm the Integrated Assessment Program Director at the Graham Environmental Sustainability Institute at the University of Michigan. And it's my pleasure to invite you here for this session, which we're describing as an overview and discussion of our project, which is on the screen, Hydraulic Fracturing in Michigan, an Integrated Assessment. And I'd like to start by saying my thanks to the various University of Michigan partners who are working with us on this topic, and that includes the U of M Risk Science Center, the URB Institute, and the Energy Institute. Our plan for today is to give an overview of what we're doing, how we're going about it, the topics that we're covering. You'll hear from a panel of faculty who are leading the preparation of 7 technical reports, and you'll also hear about the process that we're going to be using. I'd like to welcome both the folks that are here at the meeting here in Lansing, and also say that we're so happy to have about 150 people following us through the webcast online. So we've got a really great group of folks with us for this event today, both here in person and following online. Our plan for today is we're doing the welcome and the introductions right now. Bill Rustum, the Director of Strategic Policy from the Governor's Office, will be offering a few opening remarks in a minute. I'll give an overview about the process that we're using and the timeline, kind of what we're doing, how we're going about it. And then the bulk of our time today will be hearing from the faculty who are leading what we're calling these 7 technical reports on hydraulic fracturing in Michigan. They'll all be talking a little bit about kind of what they're looking at, how they're approaching their topic, and the sources of information that they're using. And then we'll end our time together with about a half hour to 45 minutes for questions both from folks here in the room and also taking some folks from folks that are following online. They are able to submit questions, and we have somebody who's monitoring it. The next thing I'd like to do is introduce our panel. The folks that are here from the University of Michigan, the faculty who are leading the preparation of these reports. What I'd like to do is start from the opposite end of the table there and introduce Professor Johannes Schwank, who is the James and Judith Street Professor of Chemical Engineering. And he's also working with John Wilson, sitting in the audience, on the technology report. And John Wilson is a retired Shell Development Company executive and a consultant to the UM Energy Institute. Next is Dr. Brian Ellis. Brian is a postdoctoral fellow with the Michigan Society of Fellows, and he's also an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Next is Alan Burton, who is the director of the Cooperative Institute for Limnology and Ecosystems Research. Dr. Burton holds joint appointments as professor in the School of Natural Resources and Environment and the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. And he's also the director of the new University of Michigan Water Center. And he's working on the ecosystem health, or the ecology report, with Dr. Newt Nadelhofer, who I don't think is here, but Newt is a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology and the director of the University of Michigan Biological Station. Next is Dr. Neil Basu, who is an assistant professor of environmental health sciences in the School of Public Health. Sarah Gossman is a lecturer in the University of Michigan Law School, leading the Policy and Law report. The economics report is being led by Dr. Roland Zulo, and Roland is an assistant research scientist at the Institute for Research on Labor, Employment, and the Economy. And the 7th report on social and public perceptions about hydrofracking is being led by Dr. Andy Hoffman, the Holcim Professor of Sustainable Enterprise and the Director of the URB Institute for Global Sustainable Enterprise at the University of Michigan. And Professor Hoffman holds joint appointments at the Stephen M. Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan and the School of Natural Resources and the Environment. And he is working with Kim Wolski, a Research Management Fellow at the URB Institute, on the preparation of that report. So I just wanted to briefly introduce our panel. Next, I'd like to introduce Mr. Bill Rustum, who will be providing some opening remarks. Mr. Rustum is the Director of Strategy for Governor Rick Snyder. Previously, he was the owner of Public Sector Consultants, or PSC, and was the firm's president and chief executive officer. While at PSC, Mr. Rustom directed studies on the status of Michigan cities, wastewater treatment needs, recycling, and land use. Before joining the firm, Mr. Rustom was Governor William Milliken's Chief Staff Advisor on Environmental Matters and Director of the Governor's Policy Council. Following his service with the state of Michigan, Mr. Rustom became the first executive director of the Center for the Great Lakes in Chicago. He coordinated the petition drive and campaign in 1976 for the Michigan Bottle Bill and the 1984 statewide campaign for the constitutional amendment creating a Natural Resources Trust Fund. Mr. Rustom holds special expertise in public policy relating to land use, urban development, local government, and water policy. He has chaired or been principal staff for statewide task forces of the Department of Natural Resources Reorganization, the MSU Museum, the Wetland Protection Program, as well as the Michigan Land Use Leadership Council. He has also served as principal director for the People and Land Project, a grant-making program of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Mr. Rustom?
Thank you, John. And I'm also a graduate of Michigan State University, so congratulations on this week, this time. Here's hoping we meet one more time in a big tournament. Huh? And at the end of a big tournament. That'd be very, very nice for both universities. So thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. You know, this whole effort comes out of the governor's energy and environment message that he issued in November of 2012. Our past, Michigan's past, its present, and its future are all tied to the abundance of clean, fresh water in our bounty of natural resources across this state. At the same time, our economy and our future depends on providing reliable, affordable energy to homeowners and businesses. But while doing that, we must protect the environment while we promote it as a key reason people will come here to live, to work, and to play. The governor's special message focused on how those two issues are connected, and he directed in that message that various state agencies focus on making improvements in very specific ways. That message provides a framework so we can make decisions that serve Michigan both now and in the future. The approach the governor outlined in that message is a policy approach that emphasizes adaptability. Instead of trying to guess what the future holds, the governor is working to identify energy and environmental strategies that effectively serve the state no matter what the future holds. It is clear that our energy supply must be reliable, affordable, and protective of our environment. And energy has become an even more important issue in recent years because of its expense in this state, driven in part by a reduced population, by fewer businesses, by burgeoning new supplies, and by increased federal regulations on power providers, often requiring them to invest huge sums in new compliance infrastructure. This has resulted in some price increases that hinder our economic growth and directly affect Michigan's poor. In the interim, while we're working toward a new future, the governor put forth a number of key ideas in his environment and energy message regarding energy production that can help Michigan families and businesses right now. And one of the key items that was outlined was hydraulic fracturing and integrated assessment, which is what is being kicked off today. The truth is that companies have been developing oil and gas around the state for generations. We need to embrace this energy source and capitalize on its abundance in Michigan. While hydraulic fracturing has been a hot political topic around the country, Michigan has used it for about 2 decades without problems. We should continue and find ways that we need to make certain that we continue our history of safe, environment-protective gas development. To assure that our citizens have well-reasoned objective explanations of what hydraulic fracturing is and is not, the University of Michigan's Grand Sustainability Institute is undertaking an evaluation of hydraulic fracturing. The state is going to be participating in this effort on the steering committee alongside both environmental and industry groups. We're excited to be part of this Michigan-focused evaluation of various implications of hydraulic fracturing, which focus on the various areas that you've all identified here. I want to say one more thing. I've been around a long, long time in Michigan about the public policy, in the public policy arena, going all the way back to Governor Milliken. I worked on the, as was mentioned, the Natural Resource Trust Fund, which takes the proceeds from oil and gas development on state-owned land and dedicates them to purchasing new lands and development across the state through the Natural Resources Trust Fund. It's been a very successful program. The one point I want to make is I've been around this a long, long time, and there are two ways to deal with issues. You can either be about the issue or about a solution. And this effort is an effort about the solution. Where does Michigan need to go, and how do we get there? It's not enough just to talk about issues. You've got to have a solution to a problem. And I'm encouraged by the dedication that the University of Michigan has made to this program, and looking forward to your report. So thank you.
Thank you, Bill. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more, fill in some details about what is this process that we're using and how are we going about looking at this topic of hydraulic fracturing. At the Graham Institute, we use integrated assessment to carry out the Institute's mission of focusing on sustainability problem solving. It's a method to combine folks from the university, both faculty and students, with decision makers, and I will broadly say we're using that broadly defined, decision makers at all different levels, at the state level, at the local level, at the individual consumer level, and stakeholders. Basically, with an integrated assessment, it moves through a variety of different stages over about a 1 to 2 year process. Key issues involve defining the issue. What is it that we're going to look at? What is some history about a particular topic? How do we come up and evaluate particular options for moving forward? And what tools or information guides do we need to pull together to come up with, again, broadly defined policy options for a wide range of stakeholders on this particular topic? At the same time, not in sequence, but at the same time, that whole process is informed by technical reports or assessments in which we gather data, we conduct analyses, we evaluate options, and we might develop new resources such as decision-making tools. Again, at the same time, this whole process is informed by stakeholder input. That could be direct feedback on a project, providing background information or data, helping develop new goals, and helping to prioritize options. So it's this really iterative process that works with a variety of different folks interested in a topic. Certainly not everyone would be in complete agreement about particular things, but through the process, we hopefully can come up with options for which everybody sees benefit. Just, why would we do it this way? Just wanted to share some of the learnings that we've gleaned from other integrated assessments that we facilitated. The Graham Institute has about 5 or 6 of these going on right now. Just an example, some are focused on redevelopment efforts in Detroit. Another is looking at how mid-sized cities throughout and small cities throughout the Great Lakes region, what do they need to know about changing climate? We've got several looking at the issues of water and health in international settings. Actually, Dr. Basu is leading a project in Ghana, and we have another project in Peru. So we have these integrated assessments going on a variety of different topics. And what we've learned through the ones that we've completed are there are a couple of key learnings that the participants have actually identified in terms of why do it through this integrated assessment approach, what benefit is there in this type of approach. And these are the things that we've learned, that it helps generate reports and supporting data so there's a common and good understanding of a topic. In some cases, it might help modify a particular perspective from an individual stakeholder. Oftentimes, it can help create new partnerships between folks that have not worked together in the past. It might help change a particular process in terms of how decision-making is done, and it can also help in terms of leveraging or gathering together resources for continued work on a particular topic. Before we move into what we're doing on hydraulic fracturing, I just wanted to add a little bit more to what Bill Rustum had to say in terms of hydraulic fracturing in Michigan, and just start with some key points. It's been used, a process of hydraulic fracturing has been used in thousands of wells in Michigan for decades. Through a review done in 2003 by a group called Stronger, the determination of that review is that the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality has a well-managed oil and gas environmental regulatory program. Our integrated assessment that we're talking about today has been developed to focus primarily on high-volume hydraulic fracturing and to use the DEQ definition for that of activity using more than 100,000 gallons of water. But our data and analyses may cover a wider range of activity depending on the topic. One of the reasons that we're going wider with some of our analyses is that there is actually currently quite limited high-volume hydraulic fracturing taking place in Michigan at present, although there's lots of interest of what might potentially happen down the road. And we recognize that there's a broad range of perspectives on the benefits and perhaps also the problems of expanded natural gas extraction and use. Another piece I wanted to bring into the conversation is to just say a little bit about another study that is taken place that gives some interesting perspective on this topic. This is a report, just briefly I'll mention, from Resources for the Future. They recently completed a project called their Pathways to Dialogue, what the experts are saying about particularly the environmental risk of shale gas development. And what they found is of the 250 experts from a broad range of sectors who responded to the survey, ranked and organized a variety of different, over 200 risk pathways about shale gas activities. A whole range of things from burdens such as air pollution, noise, or groundwater contamination. I should repeat that these are only looking at the environmental risks associated with shale gas development. An interesting finding is that they put this all together and then organized it by the different sectors, non-governmental organizations, industry, academia, and government, and identified where is their overlap. And there were 12 areas of risk pathways that everybody agreed on. All the different groups agreed on these 12 areas. 7 involved potential risk to surface water quality. 2 involved potential risk to air quality. 2 involve risks to groundwater quality, and 1 is related to habitat disruption, but only 2 were specific to shale gas activity, and those concerned fracturing fluids, spills or disposal of surface water during use, storage, and disposal. Okay? So I think it's very interesting to kind of say when we look at what are the range of concerns, particularly from this study done by other folks looking nationally, not specifically at Michigan, is that there is a wide range of agreement on some topics, not all, but on some topics. But as we look at this topic, it is quite difficult to say we're only going to look at high volume activity versus other types of hydraulic fracturing. And there's the link. And all of this information will be available afterwards on our website. And the entire video recording will also be available on our website. So back to our integrated assessment. We're taking it in 2 phases. The first phase right now we're calling the preparation of our technical reports on key topics related to hydraulic fracturing in Michigan. And we've introduced the panel before. These are the 7 topics. Each report is going to consider and is considering a wide range of impacts and issues on the topic of hydraulic fracturing. And there will be some overlaps. We don't necessarily see that as a problem. But as we're preparing these reports, the faculty are meeting and talking with each other about how they're looking at issues so that we can build from each other's work. Once the technical reports are completed, and I'll mention the timeline in a little bit, we'll move into phase 2, which is more formally what we identify as the integrated assessment, the assessment of a variety of different options for moving forward on a particular topic. So it will build heavily from those technical reports and other input that we've been collecting along the way, but focus on an analysis of options regarding hydraulic fracturing for Michigan moving into the future. And it's slightly different in ways from what we're doing right now, is that it's, rather than collecting and analyze and pulling together these reports, we'll focus much more on the analysis of those options. And I've got policy in parentheses because we're using policy very broadly defined. It could be in a variety of different settings, not just decisions that might take place across the street at the Capitol. We'll continue to have collaboration and coordination across the teams, regular engagement with decision makers in our steering committee, and continue with a lot of input and engagement with stakeholders interested in this topic. The basic timeline that we're following is that later this month, we will send the technical reports out for peer review. We're following that process to make these reports as best as we can. They will also be shared with the steering committee, and I'll let you know who's on the steering committee in a minute. Later in April, the steering committee and the faculty will meet to discuss how can we move forward now from what we've prepared from the technical reports into what can we do in terms of coming up with an analysis of options. Once we've gone through the peer review and the teams have had a chance to finalize the reports, we plan to share those publicly in June and have a 30-day public comment period. Again, we want to have this process open to input and dialogue, throughout the whole assessment. Late July, we expect to have our plans finalized for what Phase 2, the integrated assessment, will look like. And then tentatively, we're thinking we'll have the final report, our analysis of options, ready sometime mid-2014. Who's funding this, I think, is an important thing to talk about and acknowledge. Currently, the project is completely funded through resources of the University of Michigan from several of the partner organizations. All of those funds are coming either from the general fund of the university or gift funds, which are solely at the discretion and use of the U of M. So we are not taking funding from any outside source specifically for the to conduct this activity. We have sources of funds either from the general fund or gift funds that support the broader activities of the various institutes that are involved, but we did not receive, say, a grant or a contract to complete this from any of the folks involved in the assessment. As we move forward, if that funding is not sufficient, we may seek external funding to help support particularly stakeholder engagement efforts. Right now, I think we might be okay, but if we do get additional funding for this, all of that information and sources of funding will be publicly disclosed. Realize this is kind of hard to read, but I just want to thank all the folks that are involved on the steering committee for this assessment, for their time, for their input, for their ideas, and for the connections they're helping all of us make with this work. It's a range of folks from the various partners at the University of Michigan that are involved in this, folks from the state, both the governor's office and state agencies, folks from industry, folks from environmental organizations. What we tried to do is pick organizations that reflected a broad constituency and also might have particular experience with the topic. These folks will be reviewing we've met already. They've helped design and form the project as it moves forward. They've provided input to the reports, and they will also be providing input to the reports once they're ready for distribution. And they're also the key folks that will help us determine how the project will move forward in Phase 2. So what I'd like to do next is provide each faculty member with a few minutes to talk about what they're doing. Again, this will focus on what are the key areas that they're looking at, what is their approach to preparing the report, and what types of sources of information that they're working with. I'd like to move through all of these. Each of them will have about 5 minutes or so to talk about this and the report, and then we'll open it up for questions. So rather than doing questions after each discussion of each report, we'll save it till we get through all 7, okay? So the first one that we'd like to turn to is technology. And I don't know, Johannes, would you like the clicker or?
Is this on?
Yes. So just tell me when you want me to advance.
Okay. Well, I'm very happy to be here. And our report, my role in this report together with John Wilson, was to look at the technology issues that are related to hydraulic fracturing. The way we are approaching this is to provide a very clear definition of the terms that are being used, because very often, especially in science and engineering, jargon may be used that is not easily accessible to the general public. So we are trying to provide, as one aspect of our report, a tutorial on what hydraulic fracturing is and what the various technical terms actually mean, so that it is more accessible to the general public. The other thing that we decided to do from the get-go was to see ourselves in the role what I would call an honest broker, rather than being an advocate for one particular technology. And this honest broker role essentially means that we are simply looking at the technology, what is known about it, what are the facts, what are the data that are available, without at this point putting any value judgment on one versus the other technology option that's there. So what we decided to do was to also focus on methods used in Michigan, but obviously we had to put them in context with what's going on elsewhere in the country. But Michigan has some very unique geological formations, and Brian later will go into this in more detail. And so our report from the technical end focuses to some extent on identification of issues that require additional research, in particular how one would go after the Utica-Collingwood shales and the deeper A1 and A2 carbonate deposits. And here I'm using jargon, right? But essentially, Michigan has some very deep and very tight formations that are difficult to access, which will represent a challenge for gas recovery. And so we figured this might be a good Michigan-specific focus. If you can go to the next slide, please, John.
Yes.
So what we have in our report is to summarize briefly the history of gas in Michigan. And then we looked into what techniques do exist for recovering more of this resource. And in the challenges and opportunities areas, we looked into review of the technical aspects of the current methods, what is being used. For example, we look into the role of different so-called fracking chemicals that are being used, and then also what well stimulation technologies are currently being used. And then we are also looking into the future, sort of keeping an eye on in what direction the technology for gas recovery is moving. As currently, just to give you a brief example, most fracking operations rely on water as the primary fluid that's being used to stimulate the wells. However, there are other possibilities, such as, for example, carbon dioxide that could be used, and some liquefied gases like propane and so on. And so we're also looking into what's next in this technology, in which direction is the field moving, and to what extent these things might be applicable for Michigan. And so having said that, so where did we draw our information? The information that we used, there's a large body of information available from the Michigan Department of Natural Resources on their website. So I would highly recommend for those of you who are interested to peruse that. Also, the Department of Energy has a lot of information on a website that is put together by the Energy Information Administration. And then, of course, we also relied very heavily on the existing peer-reviewed scientific literature. And so all this will be enclosed in our first phase report. And so with this, I think I'm done, and we're ready for, I think, Brian.
Yes.
Okay, so as Johannes just said, I'm putting together the report that's looking at the Michigan Basin geology within the context of future of hydraulic fracturing within the state. This slide here is showing 4 topics that will be addressed, but this is not necessarily a comprehensive list of the report, but gives an idea of the areas that we'll focus on. For example, I think it's important to look at the proximity of these unconventional reservoirs to subsurface drinking water. In Michigan, most subsurface drinking water wells tend to be quite shallow. So this is just an example of showing you the Michigan Basin strata, and I've highlighted where the glacial aquifers are on top of the sedimentary basin, and I've pointed out the relative location of 3 unconventional reservoirs, being the Antrim Shale, the A1 Carbonate, and the Utica-Collingwood Shale. I think it's also important to look at the potential fluid migration pathway. So if we're interested in water quality impacts, we need to think about where you're going to have fluids moving within the subsurface. And so the report will touch on subsurface aquifers, aquitards, and potential communication of fluids between these different formations. I'll also be looking at the factors controlling the chemical evolution of the flowback water. So as John mentioned, hydraulic fracturing tends to use water as a working fluid in addition to chemical additives. These waters migrate, or they mix with native brines. So in the state of Michigan, we have highly saline brines through most of the basin once you get down below a certain point. And you're also going to be creating disequilibrium with the rocks, and so you're going to have water-rock interactions leading to changes of the chemical evolution. And lastly, one of the topics I'll touch on is the disposal of flowback fluids. So when you have hydraulic fracturing, especially high-volume hydraulic fracturing, a good portion of the water flows back to the surface, and we'll talk about what we do with that in the state of Michigan. This is actually always disposed of in Class 2 brine injection wells, and so that the report will touch on those areas. Broadly, I think that the report is going to provide an overview of the Michigan Basin geology with a focus on water quality issues. John, you can go to the next slide. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of covering the approach. It's similar to, I think we've all had a similar approach to this, which is we are not going out and creating new data necessarily, but we're reviewing the existing literature, assessing the current state of knowledge, and identifying data gaps. So I view this report as an opportunity to discuss the current state of knowledge and identify future opportunities for study moving into the second phase of this analysis. And I personally want to use the report as an opportunity to provide a broad overview of Michigan Basin geology. So for folks who don't know much about sedimentary formations or what Michigan looks like, I think this is, we're showing the state of Michigan there, and the lower peninsula actually looks like a bowl. And so you have a series of sedimentary strata designed in a bowl shape. And the report will discuss the specific implications of this for the state, because I think that state-by-state issues are going to be tied to the state-specific geology. And then lastly, because as John mentioned earlier, there is not a lot of high-volume hydraulic fracturing taking place within the state of Michigan at this time. We'll be looking at comparing and contrasting knowledge and experience gained in other states where this activity is more prevalent. Next slide. And then the sources of information, I think definitely I've relied heavily on peer-reviewed literature. However, there is this literature is somewhat limited, and so I've been also looking at industry and government reports. And then in particular, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality has an online oil and gas database, which is quite helpful for use in gathering this information. Because of past history of oil and gas drilling within the state of Michigan, the basin is the geology is quite well characterized. And then lastly, the GeoWebface, which is a fairly new online interactive tool, which couples the database information and GIS for the state. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Alan Burton. I'm looking at the environmental ecological issues associated with this subject. And if you think about the disposal of fluids are all deep well, and your actual fracturing is deep. The primary concerns to the environment are going to be from near surface kinds of activities. So that would include site disturbance kinds of issues from just actually installing the infrastructure, the roads, the well pads, the day-to-day drilling operation that's going on. Whenever you have that, it's just like any construction activity. You're going to have erosion occurring, and so you're going to start worrying about the runoff of the erosion and the nutrients into neighboring waters. The second issue, of course, that's been identified in the public has been water withdrawal issues. So you're withdrawing water to do the fracturing. Is that actually impacting the nearby surface waters, which would be streams and wetlands? Obviously, the state of Michigan is blessed with a lot of water, and so we maybe have less of an issue than some states do, but nevertheless, we do experience drought conditions. So your concern is going to be primarily during drought conditions, summer conditions, when you might tend to have low flows occurring. The third area is really looking at the density of the wells and where they're being located in relationship to ecologically sensitive areas. Obviously, we have some areas that are high biodiversity that are very sensitive and pristine that one might tend to worry about more than they would an area that's been already developed. It may have a very low diversity. So thinking about where these are located and are they in sensitive areas. And the final point that we're focusing on is just plain quality control. As with any operation, quality control is important. So do you have measures in place that are going to restrict issues like runoff and potential for spills? If you look at the next slide, our process, of course, is we've been reviewing the literature. We've been identifying the data gaps, which is quite easy to do. And we've been thinking about how these operations relate to human activities that we do know a lot about. And because this is mainly a surface impact, there are a lot of case examples and lessons that we've learned from other activities that are very applicable here. So the data gaps that relate to fracturing may not be quite so important for my topic, because we can draw on experience of other kinds of activities that cause disturbance. The third point that we're looking at is programs that the state has in place, and one of them is the water withdrawal assessment tool that's in place to make sure that too much groundwater isn't withdrawn. A second is a program dealing with wetlands protection. And also we're looking at the biological assessment tools that are being used out there by the state, and a variety of geographic information system kinds of tools that help people look at landscape versus impacts and pull those together to make good management decisions. So very useful tools that really apply to this subject. And finally, identifying the likely stressors that are associated with these activities, looking at the peer-reviewed literature and trying to draw on that. If you Google this subject in relation to ecological impacts, you're not going to find a lot of literature that's there that's coming out of the peer-reviewed science literature. So we're having to draw on other sources to draw any kind of conclusions. So finally, the slide, we're looking at the existing studies that are out there. As I mentioned, we're talking to colleagues in the field who are looking at this subject. There's a number of government studies that are ongoing. There's virtually none that have been completed, but we're talking to the people that are involved in those studies, and of course looking at the literature. Thank you.
Thanks. Neil?
Great. So my team Human Health is, we're really adopting a public health framework. So the report that we're working on right now is rather holistic and multidisciplinary. We're not just considering workers in hydraulic fracturing sites, but also people that may use the lands and spaces that surround hydraulic fracturing sites, and also the communities that are located close to these facilities. And we're doing so across the entire life cycle, so from conception of a site all the way down to active drilling, production, et cetera. Our report is really geared towards these three areas, so the workplace, the surrounding ecosystem, and the communities nearby. And for each, we're identifying a number of hazards. We're trying to understand and discuss these hazards in terms of human exposure. So what are the hazards and how are people actually being exposed to them? And in any public health report, you need to think about prevention. So once we can understand how people are exposed to these hazards, we can next start trying to understand how to prevent exposures in the first place. Bullet number 2 is important. We can document a number of hazards, but we need to realize that hazard and risk are not the same thing. And this is a basic tenet in public health. Clearly, there are a number of hazards in hydraulic fracturing sites, but if they're properly managed or engineered, or public health does its job in terms of prevention, they may not pose much of a risk. Nonetheless, these hazards do exist, and even if they're not risky, there's always going to be an important public perception about these hazards. And I think that's a very important component to the public health report, which Professor Hoffman will talk about momentarily. The third bullet it just comes back to the basic fact that all energy development schemes have risks and benefits. Hydraulic fracturing, if you compare that to oil, to coal, to wind, to solar, all of these different energy development schemes have a benefit to society, but they can also have risks to humans and the environment. So we need to look at hydraulic fracturing in a holistic manner to look at the benefits and costs in relation to other energy development schemes. Next slide. So the approach that we're taking in the human health group is very similar to the other groups. Bottom line is we're reviewing evidence as best as possible. We're trying to draw upon the peer-reviewed scientific literature. But with that being said, in Michigan, for Michigan-specific data, there really is not that much. So what we have to do is to look beyond Michigan to experiences from other regions in which there is intense hydraulic fracturing occurring and some scientific knowledge-based building. So we're trying to collate that evidence and try to put it into a Michigan-specific context. As the report is developing right now, it's really turning out to be what I would call a hazard identification piece. So if you think about what a normal risk assessment looks like, the first step is to identify hazards. And what we can do right now, I believe, with the evidence at hand, is to get at that, is to identify the hazards in Michigan in these facilities, and hopefully via phase 2 is to do a more rigorous quantitative assessment of these hazards. Next slide. So these are the sources of information, not that much different from the aforementioned group. Again, we're trying to gather as much information as we can from the peer-reviewed literature. We're drawing upon some federal agency reports too, and also a myriad of other sources ranging from the internet to frac-focused databases, et cetera. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Sarah?
Thanks. So I am doing the policy law report, and so the first part of the report is to really look at laws governing the life cycle of a well, and here to look both at hydraulically fractured wells as well as specifically at high volume hydraulic fracturing. And I'm taking a life cycle approach, so I'm actually looking at everything from mineral rights and leasing all the way through to drilling and well construction, and then from there to hydraulic fracturing itself and completion, and to finally to disposal and possible claims in court about contamination. In doing this, I look at Michigan specifically and the laws that would apply to operators here in Michigan, but I'm also looking at trends in other states and what states are doing there. A number of other things that I'm looking at are the level of government, that is, who is governing these particular issues. Is it the federal government? Is it state governments? Is it localities? The type of law, that is it statutory or legislative, administrative, rules, guidance, or court decisions? And the policy approach. So what are the types of policies being used? Are they prescriptive requirements, market-based, informational, like disclosure? Even in our field, we think about court decisions as being deterrent, that is, creating standards themselves. So courts actually in making standards. Next slide. Mm-hmm. So our approach, a lot of it is focused on researching the status of federal, state, and local law, looking at the legal and policy scholarship, and here, as in the other reports, just beginning. There's not a lot out there, but there's some. The scholarship that is out there is not focused on Michigan specifically, but on sort of general issues. And then we are looking at a comparative analysis of states, looking at key issues and trends, and thinking about how those are occurring across the states and how they compare to what's happening in Michigan. Right, next slide. So sources of information, here looking at legal policy databases, looking at government publications and websites, looking at other comparative state analyses. There have been other comparative state analyses, so we can draw from some of that work to think about trends in the various states.
Thank you. Roland?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Roland. My role in this is to take a look at the economic dimensions of fracturing. My approach was to just begin by providing a general overview of some of the major issues related to the economics of hydraulic fracturing. And then we wanted to give a special focus on the issue of jobs. And the reason why we do that is because employment is used so often in the discussions about whether or not we should promote hydraulic fracturing. So in looking at jobs, the way to think about it is that the way economists break it apart is we first ask, well, what are the direct jobs in the industry, right? Those are the jobs employed, the employees of firms that are actually actively doing drilling. And then there's what's called the indirect employment effect, and those are the jobs created when there's activity in an industry from all the suppliers in the chain that also have to hire persons to supply the more general activity. And then finally, there's a third group, the induced activity, induced employment, which is, the way to think about that is it's the growth in employment caused by just having more wealth in the pockets of workers in the industry. So it's the added employment caused by the consumption, the greater consumption that happens when workers receive the wages they receive. So our approach is to sort of look at four, the report will outline four major areas of economic, four topics related to economics. The first is private royalties and leases. The second is state revenues from royalties, taxes, leases, and storage. And on both of those topics, there's administrative data that we've acquired to answer those questions. Then there's changes in property values, which is a sort of an intriguing topic, which we don't have data for, but we will discuss based upon a literature review. And then finally, employment. The employment will be our focus. Here, what we'll do is we'll match the job counts in the industry, which we have, against the industry activity itself. So we want to not just simply know about how many jobs are in the industry, but we also want to prepare estimates for how a change in the industry activity can affect the level of jobs. The main source of data, this third slide at this point. The main source of data we're using on the jobs and will come from the quarterly census of employment and wages. It's the survey taken by the federal government to essentially count jobs in the industry. We'll use that. We'll match it up against data which was made available from the Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, provided us with all kinds of industry activity data, so we'll match that up to come up with estimates. In the end, we'll produce a longitudinal spatial regression estimates to hopefully shed some light on how the industry does help grow our economy. Thanks.
Thank you. Andy.
Okay, I'm Andy Hoffman, and the report that I, with Kim Wolski, will produce, you can think of as the sociology of the fracking debate. The topic has received a lot of attention in the media, in Hollywood, some accurate, some less so. But the question is, how do you perceive the issue of fracking? How do people in the general public perceive the issue of fracking? Which risks do they attend to? Which ones do they ignore? How is that debate formed? This is critically important for a topic like this. People act as voters, as landowners, as employees, as business owners, as citizens, as activists, as consumers, and how they perceive this issue will play out in those various domains in which people act. So what we're going to try and capture in this report is a general sense of what the people think, what the general public thinks when they think about fracking. What do they hear when they hear that word? What factors influence that perception, and are there differences in different communities, different populations? Do they differ by demographics, by economics, by geography? All these factors come in and influence people's perceptions of issues such as fracking. And then what might we expect in public perceptions of fracking if high-volume hydraulic fracking increases? As Nil talked about, there are studies to show a boomtown effect, that there is a life cycle and there are changes in the impacts of fracking. How does that correlate with changes in the perceptions of fracking? And then finally, what is the nature of the dialogue and the debate about fracking in Michigan specifically? Next slide. The kinds of information we're going to draw together, starting off, there are a lot of national and state level public opinion polls. We're going to try and gather as many as we can, doing some screening for the rigor of those studies. Some of them are better than others, but we've so far found about 36 such studies. What is people's general awareness of the issue? Are they aware of it? Do they support or oppose it? What issues or what concerns do they have? What are the risks and the benefits as people see them? And are there supports for related policy measures, for example, increased regulation and mandatory disclosure of chemicals? How does this play in? So we'll grab as much of that data as we can. And then there's a second set of data that's quite interesting when you go straight into a local community. You interview people that are living within the domains in which fracking is taking place. And there are some studies, particularly in Texas, Pennsylvania, and New York, looking at talking to people directly affected by fracking. What are their perceptions of the risk? How do they change over time? And we'll focus on that. And then finally, we will do an analysis of the key issues raised by Michigan-specific stakeholders. Similar to the Resources for the Future study that John mentioned at the beginning, looking at different groups of nonprofits, academics, business people, scientists. What are the issues of critical concern in those different domains and those different populations? How do they overlap? How do we use that to try and understand what the issues are at play? Third slide. And then finally, we're going to build on a lot of, there's a lot of research, decades of research, in fact, on risk perception, risk communication. There's a big difference, as Nil pointed out, between risk and hazard. There's a big difference between risk that people willingly impose upon themselves, smoking cigarettes, riding a motorcycle without a helmet, and those that they feel are imposed upon them, such as hazards from industrial activity, and that's critically important. Are there ways we can learn from other controversial issues, the way the debate over nuclear power is played out, or hazardous waste and hazardous waste sites? Can that give us any insights into the public perception of this issue? And then how might all of this feed into creating a constructive dialogue, a more informed dialogue on the costs and benefits of fracking?
Great, thank you. So we wanted to give that very brief overview and introduction to the different reports and the process. What we'd like to do now is just open it up to questions and discussion. What's most helpful to us at this point, given that the reports are not complete, is to hear, are there other areas that you think we should be thinking about? Are there other sources of information or ideas that we should consider in the preparation of these reports? they're drafted, they're being worked on, they're going to be sent out for peer review in March. So we still have this opportunity to have, that's the key point here, is to have this opportunity to talk about how we're going about this and what we're looking at, and to get input on that. To help with that conversation, we're going to have two folks in the room here. So let me introduce Veronica Wilkerson-Johnson from the Lansing Service Center of the University of Michigan's Vice President for Government Relations Office, and also Tracy Swinburne, the Managing Director of the Risk Science Center at U of M. They'll be moving around the room with microphones. I'd ask when you state your question to tell us who you are, and if you're representing somebody, that's helpful to know, or if you're a particular area in Michigan, add what you can to help us know who you are to understand your question. And then Manya Holland, my colleague from the Graham Institute, will be following online, because we've got, as I said, over 100 folks following this online, and they can also submit questions. So the folks that are following online, if you don't see the question form, just scroll down on your web page, and it's right there where you're watching the webcast, and it'll be submitted straight into Manya's email box. So hopefully we've got a variety of ways to gather questions, and let's just turn it over to some questions. So yes, there's one in the back there, Veronica. And if you could wait till the mic is there, because we want to make sure that the folks following online can hear.
Hi, I'm Rita Chapman, and I work with the Michigan Sierra Club here in Michigan. I'm working 100% full-time now on this particular issue in our state. I didn't see the words climate change, and I'd like to know if the study will be looking at climate change, given that it is manifesting its ugly self in our communities all over the country, all over the world. And if you're not looking at that, why not?
I'll start, and then I'll say if folks want to add to that from the panel, we can address that topic. I'd say from my perspective, and I should frame this that I am not an expert. The experts are over here to my right. I'm the person who's facilitating the process. But as we put this together and looked at it in terms of a Michigan-specific focus, I think sometimes it's very difficult to address a broader topic like climate change. So that is one of the reasons why it's not one of the main reports. I don't know if any of the other panelists, Alan?
We will be addressing climate change to the degree that we can. It's certainly with the increased extreme storm events that are going to occur, with the increased variability in the water cycle, that will affect the issues we are looking at, which would be surface runoff, erosion, water withdrawal. So it will be part of that discussion.
Mm-hmm. And I would add that it will come out in the social perceptions if that's the connection that people make. If in the public opinion polling people do make that connection between natural gas and climate change, then we expect that to show itself.
The one aspect that we are looking into in the technical report deals with methane gas leakage. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and there's methane leakage occurring naturally, as well as from natural gas pipelines, distribution systems, and also, of course, natural gas wells. And so we are looking into the issue of methane leakage specifically.
And in the human health report, as part of that section on trade-offs in energy sources, we do have a couple paragraphs on issues such as methane and greenhouse gases.
Mm-hmm. Then I'd just say that we are looking at the Clean Air Act regulation on green completion. So from that legal point of view, we're looking at climate.
Thanks, Sarah. Great. Yes.
I'm from Lapeer County. I had a big meeting with local farmers about this to learn about it. We presented information about fracking as well as information on what they could do for themselves. My wife and I have gone to about 10 meetings ever since then. That was in February because it's a big topic. And what I'd like to say is this. The law person mentioned the complete cycle. I think that is a major thing, the complete cycle, the input, the site, and the output. And the reason I mention that is I'm most concerned about the disposal wells, and I believe that the health person who's going to be working with the hazards also needs to possibly look at the disposal wells and what hazards they will present. I believe that the environmental person who mentioned withdrawal, which I think is a huge issue, I think a bigger issue is the disposal wells, and that, you know, what happens to the water there, and does it ever come back, and where does it go? The economics person did not mention the costs in the future of what is going to happen to the disposal wells, because I think they will be a time bomb unless they're not, unless.
So,
and finally,
okay.
The geologist mentioned that that he's looking for opportunities to study, and it seems to me, again, this is where the science is completely lagging. Everything I look up has very little good to say about disposal wells or nothing.
So,
and I'd like to see that area be part of every one of the groups.
Okay. Could you state your name, sir?
My name is Dean Suzanis. I'm from Lapeer County.
Great.
I'm a former physics teacher.
Thanks for being here. So just want to make sure we understand the primary concern seems to be about disposal wells and how each of the teams might be covering those. Okay. Anybody want to say a little bit more? We talked on it a little bit, but anybody want to add?
I think I can start off on that. I am discussing disposal wells within the report for sure, because I think that within the state that is the primary way that we're disposing of produced fluids and the flowback waters, whereas you have states like Pennsylvania are forced to either truck fluids sometimes to Ohio or treat on site or send to municipal plants. The state of Michigan is in a different position as far as our unique geological characteristics, which allow us to inject into these disposal formations. However, I think that there is an opportunity to look into that further, and I'll be discussing that within the report for sure.
Neil?
Dean, you're correct. I mean, the disposal wells is something we're looking at as part of our life cycle assessment of the hydraulic fracturing industry, and there will be paragraphs in our report which we aim to increase our understanding of issues related to potential hazards associated with that aspect of hydraulic fracturing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, Tracy.
Hello, my name is Susan Harley. I'm the Michigan Policy Director with Clean Water Action. I have a number of questions, so I don't know if you want to take them one at a time, or shall I pose several at once?
Why don't we start with one, and then we do have some time, but let's start with one so we give some other folks a chance.
That sounds fine. My question is to Roland on the economic study, and I was wondering whether or not you plan to do a study where you look at the potential trade-offs to clean energy jobs for increased investments in natural gas.
Thanks.
No, I think our study is going to be much more limited than that. We could begin to take. I mean, the discussion that's taking place about natural gas extraction is that it's a bridge, if you will, over to clean energy methods. That it's a method of it's an energy source which is not quite as carbon heavy as some others, like especially coal. And no, so the short answer is no. I'm not going to take a look at the trade-off in jobs.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to take another question? Sure, go ahead.
Sure. Kind of on the topic of gaps then in information, it sounds like this is the majority going to be a literature review with that gap analysis. What will be the next steps as far as original research that's planned to come out of this study?
Sure, I'll start with that. So with integrated assessments, we primarily rely on existing information. One of the options that could come out of the analysis would be, to do more work, but that is not planned to be part of this assessment. over the next year. Some of the studies I think that, folks have suggested or are thinking about would be more longitudinal analyses, which we can't do within a year. So that may be some of the options that are generated through the assessment, but we don't have plans to do more in kind of new original research through the process we're engaged in right now. Okay. Manya, did you have anything? I'm sorry, I just wanted to give the folks following online. Sir, could you pass it up to Manya? Thank you.
Sure. So this question comes from Kiri Ravani from Oakland County, Michigan. And the question is, so much misinformation and fear rules the public mind, as was evident at the town hall meeting in West Bloomfield last week. What is the plan to obtain extensive participatory comments? What is the plan for educating the public about fracking, water, and wastewater, air, restoration, et cetera? As a member of ASTM committee forming standard for the subject of fracking, I'd like to know.
Oh, that committee. John, I believe you're a part of that committee, yes?
Yeah, well, yeah, kind of.
Veronica, could you pass? Maybe while we're getting the mic to John Wilson, let me just say in terms of our process, in terms of stakeholder engagement, we're hosting events like this. We plan to have more in the future. I think one of our objectives is to, through these reports, provide some really good information for folks interested in this topic or concerned about this topic. I think that may also be some of the things that come out of the public perceptions report too, in terms of, I don't want to speak for you, but just before John talks about that committee, do you want to say what we might be able to do to help the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, certainly part of the social perceptions report will talk about techniques and methods for creating a much more constructive public engagement. My sense is that is not the direct initiative of this integrated assessment, though.
Right. And then part of the question was about this committee that's formed, and I don't remember the acronym, but I believe, John, you're a part of that committee. If you could just tell folks what that committee is and what they're trying to do.
Well, I think it's still trying to make up its mind what it's going to do. But ASTM has formed a committee to take a look at fracking. It was a pretty broad definition of fracking that was decided upon. Clearly an appropriate topic, because there are standards for fracking that don't exist and need to exist, and ASTM, of course, is very good at setting standards for whatever.
Could you just say, what is ASTM? Is it
American Society for the Testing of Materials, I think, is where it began.
Okay.
Although everybody now thinks it's sort of a group of people that set standards for almost anything you can imagine could possibly need a standard. And indeed, it has done that in many areas, like fuels, for example. Take a look at the list of publications by ASTM, and you can see the enormous breadth of stuff that they do. I just caught a couple of points in that question that I thought were important and needed comment on. One is education. One of the things that's disturbed me the most, and Johannes and I have talked about this a few times, is that we have an awful lot of people very enthusiastically expressing opinions, and appropriately too, but not always with facts behind them. And one of the things that we can help, I hope, people do is understand better what the facts behind fracking are and what those facts mean in terms of some of the concerns that have been expressed about the technology.
Thank you. Great. If we could pass it back to the gentleman, Veronica. Yes.
Hi, my name is Todd Bizette, and I'm with the Committee to Ban Fracking in Michigan. We are looking to get a petition together to ban it entirely. I think we're pretty much aware of what its impacts are from a macro level, and it sounds like this study is going to be yet another one of the studies that we see. Hopefully provides a little bit more insight, or at least collects some of the data. But I guess my question is to Mr. Zullo. I think your role is probably going to be the most important, because it's really the economics that it determines what's going to happen with the study, whether it just gets ignored or thrown away, or what happens. But I am a little bit disappointed to hear that you're not going to be considering things like the impact of tourism or environmental impact. And there's yet another thing that came to, speaking of that town hall in Oakland County, somebody had mentioned to me that there is an earthquake insurance that people are having to pursue in other states related to the injection wells. And so there's so many impacts to this fracking economically. And I think the natural gas industry has done a really good job of presenting the fact, talking about public perception, that it has a great impact. I guess I'd also like to know if you're going to cover the foreign interest in the natural gas industry that has occurred since like about 2008. I mean, these are all things that, you know, we can say it contributes to our economy, but does it contribute locally? So, Professor Zullo, I guess we're really interested to see what you're going to present.
Sure. I hope I'm not the focus of this report, but I don't do well under pressure. But let me say, we will look at when we look at what's called induced jobs. So, asking the question, how does the industry affect jobs in the local economy? We will look for, and this is an area that no one has touched so far, negative job effects. So tourism and farming are two areas where we might find that actually increased hydraulic fracturing, more industry activity actually decreases the job counts there. So we will look at that. So that's one area. The other, on foreign interest, it's a good point. I mean, what we're seeing in Michigan is, I don't know if you want to call them foreign, but we have firms coming from Texas, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma. So, and roughly what we've seen from the data is that about half the gas extraction in the state comes from firms outside of Michigan. So we will do our best to try to determine the Michigan impact and not this sort of broader impact. Because you're right, intuitively, a firm that comes in, extracts our resources, sells that resource is not quite the same as a firm that is here in the state providing jobs and a paycheck that stays here in the state. So we will look at those.
Mm-hmm. Foreign interest is also out.
Yeah, well, there's some Canadian firms, sure.
Yeah. Chinese, right?
You're talking in terms of investors,
yeah,
right?
Wall Street Journal just put out an article about how much they've invested in billions in the natural gas, companies. So
Mm-hmm. I don't think that's part of your analysis, though.
No,
Yeah.
We're not looking so much at the investors as the industrial activity taking place in the state. So.
Did you also have a question about seismic activity, or were you just more of a comment?
I was just making a comment
Okay.
as to how widespread the impact is.
Sure. We're ready. Next person right behind.
Hi, I'm William Brammer. I'm with the company Pangea Water Solutions, originally in Tampa, also with A Power. It's a company coming out of Detroit. And one of the questions I have relates, going across technology to environmental remediation to policy, is to what extent is industry being surveyed or will be surveyed as to technologies that could put this water back to productive use rather than injecting it into brine wells to desalinate, remove the caustics. And then along with that, to what degree, such as Ohio has done with their licensing procedures of requiring seismic studies, to what degree will this committee or this study be looking at requiring certain remediation techniques or technologies to be used in order to gain a license to then be able to institute a fracking well and going forward from there.
Okay, so I think the first part of the question was about technology for water. And Johannes?
Yeah, we are going to look very carefully at the water reuse issue and water purification issue. And part of this equation will also be to look into alternatives to using water in the first place. But we are going to look at various technologies that are in place to reuse water, to flow back water.
And then the second part about seismic activity, I didn't quite.
Well, I was wondering what Ohio is doing with seismic activity, is, for example, requiring seismic reports prior to licensing a well.
Okay.
So therefore,
anybody?
Some of the issues, including water remediation,
And,
So
Okay.
I think I can say something briefly on that. And so there is not a lot of, I mean, there's only, I think only, I don't want to state a number, but there's not many high-volume hydraulic fracturing wells in the state of Michigan. So most of the produced fluids and the flowback waters come from existing oil and gas wells. And by and large, Michigan has high water production from a lot of its oil and gas, like current production. So outside of the increase in high-volume hydraulic fracturing that might take place. So the flowback water that you're referring to in Ohio is by and large from, say, the state of Pennsylvania is being trucked over, and you have new injection wells that are coming online. In the case of Michigan, I think that almost exclusively these are existing wells that have already been receiving fluids from existing production for a long time that maybe are accepting additional fluid. And so there's maybe that delta that you could look at, but I think that most of the wells are already permitted, so I'm not sure. I don't want to get into the permitting process. Maybe Sarah could speak to that, but.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about requirements for disposal wells that comes off of the Youngstown incident. And yeah, we haven't really looked that much at seismic requirements, but thank you. I'll think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Manya, is there another question we could take from online first?
I have.
Oh, we'll get you next, sir.
So this question comes from Nancy Schiffler from Washtenaw County, and her question is, to what extent will the analyses, particularly health and environment, look at cumulative impacts, both in terms of density of drilling and over time?
Okay.
That's going to be one of the focuses that we have is the propensity already out there to have high-density sites. So that's already been identified as an environmental concern for a number of reasons. So we'll definitely be looking at that. But of course, we can't be looking at that really in Michigan because it doesn't exist yet. But we'll talk about some cases where it does exist for the environment.
Mm-hmm. Neil, did you want to add?
I would say the exact same thing for the human health report, that this is something we will be touching base on in our report, but principally from evidence taken from other states.
Great, thanks. And who was waiting? Yes, sir. Yeah.
So first I want to commend University of Michigan for taking this initiative and really a leadership position to really understand the impacts to Michigan on their own dime. My name is Dan Radomski. I'm with Next Energy. We support the energy sector as an incubator to industry. And I'm wondering, this probably impacts both the technology and the economics part of the study, to what degree the investigation is going to look into not only the challenges, but some of the technologies that are trying to solve those challenges. And I'm not just talking about the drilling techniques and the advancements there, but you know, the sleeving that protects groundwater and some of the investments that are going into next generation innovation there. Water recovery, reuse, the mitigation of methane leakage at the wellhead. There's even a lot of investment looking at when these wells are expended, you could potentially use them as a cavern for compressed air energy storage. So I'm just wondering to what degree we're looking at that and making that known so Michigan companies and universities can work on those problems and develop next generation IP and products and services to create jobs for Michigan.
Thanks, Dan. Johannes?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. You're right on. I mean, this is the most exciting part of our technical work here, to start looking into where do we go from here and where are technology gaps and where can new technology come in that will improve the situation. One of the interesting things we are going specifically to look into is the question of how methane and carbon dioxide interact with the various formations. And there's an opportunity there to maybe use some of the wells as CO2 disposal wells for to mitigate carbon dioxide emissions from other activities. So that's a very interesting aspect of it. The other thing we are going to look into is the new technologies, the water-free technologies that are on the horizon, which would take away a lot of the issues with water use and withdrawal. And so these things need to be, they're in the, I would say, experimental stage. There are very few companies who are actually using it, and definitely more research is needed in these areas.
Yeah, on economics, I would say that our analysis is looking retrospectively at data over the past decade. So it's hard to take that and project what will happen in terms of jobs going forward. But I think it's fair to hypothesize that the new technologies coming out, and especially with high-volume hydraulic fracturing, what it appears to be doing is increasing the amount of technical jobs needed in the field, which will generally make those jobs higher-paid jobs. But by the same token, there's a reduction in the number of people needed with added technology, especially with high-volume fracturing. So that's how we would hypothesize the change in jobs over time with new technology.
If I may just add something, this is not part of our technical report, but it might be interesting for all of you. For many years, there has been a transfer of jobs in the chemical industry to foreign countries because the chemical industry always builds their facilities and puts their jobs where there's cheap natural gas. So one of the consequences of the natural gas, the increase in natural gas supply in the United States has been a very dramatic and even by industrial standards unprecedented transfer of investments in the chemical industry back into the United States. And what this means literally thousands and thousands of new jobs in the chemical industry that would go offshore otherwise. And the economic impact on the United States will be tremendously positive in the sense of capital reinvestment in the United States rather than in foreign countries, especially multinational corporations. They always go where there's the cheapest natural gas supply.
Yeah, and let me just add that we will capture that. We're studying that now, and Johannes is right. The data is showing that the supply of natural gas and also the reduction in the spot price because of that supply is creating an incentive, if you will, for certain industries to grow jobs here in Michigan. So we will take a look at that as well.
Great. Yes, in the back.
A comment following on that. Rita Chapman again from the Michigan Sierra Club.
Thank
Shell just announced that they want to build a liquefied natural gas terminal in Sarnia, right across the water from us, and then ship their product out the St. Lawrence Seaway. So there's proposals also around our coastlines all over the place, around the country. That will drive up fracking. That will likely drive the price of natural gas up. Even Dow Chemical has come out against those LNG facilities. I hope I'm getting that right.
Okay.
At any rate, have you taken that into consideration yet? I mean, it looks like you're going broader than Michigan and effects and impacts in Michigan. So this is another one. This is another one. So are you looking at that globalization issue?
Could you I'm not certain I quite followed it. The globalization of
sending our natural gas out of our country.
Exporting.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Anybody?
Yeah, maybe I can comment a little bit on the scope of natural gas production in Michigan. Michigan currently produces about 18% of the gas that is consumed in the state itself. The rest is imported. So Michigan is a long way away from becoming a net exporter of natural gas. The other thing is that natural gas production in Michigan has been on a rather steep decline for the last 20 years. So we are far away from a boom period in natural gas production in Michigan.
Okay. Yes, I think we have one in the back, right, Freddie?
Hi,
Yes.
my name is Brian Burrows. I'm the executive director for Trout Unlimited in Michigan, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and the work that you're undertaking. My question is mainly, I think, for Dr. Burton. On the ecology report, you mentioned the water withdrawal assessment tool, and I was wondering if you might be able to elaborate the depth of analysis you might provide on the adequacy of that tool for these water uses for the purpose of hydraulic fracturing?
We're looking at that right now. trying to understand what its strengths and limitations are. You know, at first look, it looks wonderful, but having chaired a former geology department at one point in dealing with hydrogeologists, I know that usually the problem is there's not enough data, and you can only extrapolate with groundwater so far. So we'll be looking closely at that and trying to identify what the limitations of that tool are.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes.
Deborah Salerno, medical writer. Thank you for your work with this issue. And as a medical writer, you may have heard of the Cochrane review method. It's a systemic review. It sounds like that's what we're doing here, is a systemic review of the data. And so I'm wondering, are each of you using pretty much a similar process for that systemic review? I'm not quite sure I caught it. And I'm curious if you'll be providing both a quantitative and a qualitative assessment of the data.
I'd say we're not using anything systematically. I think we're following some similar procedures, but you know, sources of information and data are very different depending on the topic that we're looking at. I don't know if any of the faculty want to respond to that in terms of your approach. Yeah. Oh, okay.
It's pretty much a qualitative weight of evidence is all you can do with the kinds of studies we're finding, which are few and far between. You know, there's no way you can do any meta-analysis or anything because the data's just not there. A handful of individual studies, a lot of studies that have opinions without much data, so it makes it quite challenging.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yes. Tracy, thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, Tom Baird for Dr. Burton. I was wondering how this group will interface with the other body that the governor created. I think it's the Water Use Council, which has begun meeting just last month, perhaps. And I wondered how these two bodies will be interacting in connection with water use, the water withdrawal tool, those issues.
At present, there's no plan to interact with that group. We were doing an independent analysis looking at the water withdrawal tool and all of the issues. I think in the next phase of this, phase 2, the integrated assessment tool, you might get at some interactions like that. I don't know if
yes,
you have
no,
more, John.
We have not directly engaged with them yet, but we'll take that into consideration in terms of a group to work with. We are working directly with, is that through a particular state agency? I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, Brian, I think, is on that group, Water Use Council, Advisory Council.
Is that hosted by a particular?
At this point, it's a DEQ, sanctioned advisory council, and we would be glad to work at any point. Myself is on it, and James Clift, who I saw that is on your steering committee, is also a member of that as well. It pertains to the water withdrawal assessment tool, absolutely, and we'd be glad to follow up with you afterwards, Dr. Burton, to try to find some ways to help you with some of that.
That's excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Manya, anything else?
Yeah.
One more?
So here's a question from Richard Frazen from the University of Michigan. The question is, will the legal aspect of the IA cover the practices used by the oil and gas companies to obtain leases from individual landowners?
Okay. I think I'll take that one directly to Sarah. I won't touch it.
All right. So, so we talk generally about leasing. Yeah, it's not possible for us to do review of the many, many leases that have been signed. So I think we have to take it from sort of a broad perspective around contract law, what these leases usually contain, and the issues that might be specific, if there are any, to hydraulic fracturing. So that's the level at which we're taking it.
Okay, thank you. Yes, in the back.
Yes, my name is Ann Susanis. I'm from Lapeer County.
Hello.
And I really appreciate your having this. I think public input and understanding is critical to this issue. I have two questions, and one is maybe just rhetorical. The first one is, how will you identify the sensitive areas that you talked about where there should not be? I assume what you mean is there should not be drilling. And the second one is, as you folks expressed your different areas that you were studying, there's not a lot of specific information for Michigan yet, and that makes sense. And yet the process in Michigan rushes on. So is there some way that you can take this into account? Where, you know, the science is now coming out, but in the meantime, the activity is ongoing, and I just wonder how you are able to deal with that. Thank you.
So maybe first the ecological areas, sensitive areas?
Sure. As I mentioned during my presentation, since most of the impacts to the ecology are going to be at the surface, and they're due to some large degree, I believe, to disturbance. We have a huge body of literature and experience in this area. So just by looking at the simple construction of the sites, their density, the roads going in and out, the controls that are being put on site to prevent erosion and runoff, and then combining that with the expertise of the DEQ, who already knows where a lot of sensitive areas are. The Trout Unlimited knows a lot of the places where the sensitive areas are, where you have cold water fisheries, where you have high diversity, where you have sensitive wetlands, where you have a propensity for low flow conditions that might be harmful. I think all of that we kind of have a good idea about already. So we'll be looking at what has happened in other states as far as densities, the size of these operations, how long they're active, and trying to relate that to Michigan. And I feel fairly comfortable that we'll have a pretty good idea of what the risks are.
Okay. And just to restate to make sure I understood the second part of your question, it was how do we move forward if we don't have sufficient information? Is that, did I capture that?
Right. The process, you know, the fracking is going on, and yet I can appreciate that we don't have all the information yet. It's like, you know, what if there's an oops, and we haven't investigated these things thoroughly yet. I don't know that your study can really respond to that.
Did we cover everything? Yeah.
Well, I thought I heard in the question, how are you going to make the work Michigan specific? And I can say that, you know, when we look at the social perceptions, we can look at certain kinds of demographic data that correlate with certain kind of beliefs, and can we make comparisons between other states and Michigan? And then I would also add that there is, as we speak, a significant opinion study being done within the state of Michigan on fracking at the University of Michigan that we'll draw upon quite heavily.
Any of the other faculty want to talk about, you know, in light of not having as much information as we think we might want or need, how to move forward?
Well, one of the things I envision on putting forward is to ask in phase 2 that is a decision-making framework be established to help identify the sensitive areas and what process, the process that will be put in place by the state to ensure their protection. But that'll be phase 2.
And Neil?
And maybe I'll just add that just given the way that hydraulic fracturing development is occurring and really shooting off in the last few years, there are a number of scientific studies that we're starting to see. And there are a number of larger ones funded by industry or government, which I think in the next few years will be fruitful in terms of providing us that science-based evidence that we really need to make decisions upon.
Did you want to mention any more about those specific studies, or one is the NIH one, right?
Yep, so the National Institutes of Health is embarking upon studies both internally but also through their extramural peer-reviewed process. And the other one that's larger, that's quite grand in scope, is the US EPA's water study, which has a number of high-level, potentially high-impact studies built within it.
Yes.
My name is Monica Martinez. I'm here also on behalf of America's Natural Gas Alliance, which is certainly one of the major producers, representing 27 of the major producers around the country. Just want to acknowledge and thank the person from Sierra Club for raising the issue of the LNG, the new small LNG facility that is going to be placed in Sarnia. And if you're not aware of it, I think that might go into some of the regional economic impacts in terms of studying what is happening. And what is happening in Sarnia, this is really not for an export use, but it is for use for marine users around the Great Lakes. So it's a small facility, and that is allowing many of the vessels around the Great Lakes to convert to liquefied natural gas, and that is much cleaner than diesel or coal usage around the states, and to have it as part of Great Lakes, especially when we think about ash disposal into the Great Lakes and other items. So I'm not sure if that's something part of that regional effort when we talk about that, but that's certainly something that's a positive side when we see fleets switching over to liquefied natural gas, which is much cleaner for the environment and for our Great Lakes. Thank you.
I think one of the people that had hoped to be here today but had a last-minute conflict was Steve Kemp from a regional association working on that, Naval and Marine Naval and Marine engineers for the Great Lakes region. So yes, it is something that folks are looking into. I don't know if anybody, I think you were mostly sharing information. Yeah, we don't really. Okay. Yes. Any other questions? Or have we covered anything? Everything? One more over there. Okay. And Mani, do you have one more? We'll take one more here and then one more online.
I actually have a large number of additional questions and was wondering what the best process for that would be. Will there be additional input sessions? Is there, someone I should be sending my questions to online?
Sure. Yes. That's one of the things I'm going to mention when we wrap up.
Okay, great. Well, then I'll just pick one. And that is on the question of water use. Within the past month, we found that actual data from wells is showing that our assumptions were extraordinarily wrong as far as how much water is being used. 21 million gallons for one well. There were multiple wells on that same pad. 42 million gallons was the total used for that one well pad. So that is just brand new data coming out, and I was wondering whether or not that changed your assumptions as you were doing your research, or whether or not you were using those old assumptions.
Well, maybe I can address this from a technical standpoint. There are different ways wells are being processed. One is to do a vertical well, and to access the natural gas, usually these vertical wells are spaced much closer together. Each individual well uses a small amount of water, relatively speaking, and the alternative is to do what we call directional drilling, where one has a vertical well bore coming down, which then eventually changes direction and goes laterally over fairly large distances. One of these so-called directional wells can replace multiple individual vertical wells. So although it may look like there's a lot more water going into one particular well, these are most likely these directional wells that replace multiple vertical wells. So if you do a complete material balance, how much water is used to retrieve a certain amount of gas, you will find that there's not much difference in the actual water use, because you replace many wells with one larger one. But also the benefit is that the overall disturbance may be less, because now you have one well pad that accesses a much larger area underground, rather than having multiple pads that disturb the environment. Do you want to add something to it?
I guess I wasn't quite sure what your question was. It was more of a statement that there was a well that used, it was a high volume fracturing well that you just saw some data on. Is that correct?
No, the question was, the former assumption was that high volume wells were using approximately 5 to 6 million gallons total. And so this new data coming out is that 4 times at least as much water was used, and so it's just a new assumption. It would, I would assume that your models would need to change, but again, it's literature review, so I just didn't know how this brand new data was impacting the ecological, especially cumulative water withdrawal impacts issue that's we've discussed here.
Well, so I'll make a comment about the amount of water. I think so. The amount you're going to use to complete any particular well is going to be dependent on both the depth of that well and the lateral extent, if in the case of directional drilling. So it is not going to be, there's not some set for every well. It will be the same. And I think technically anything over 100,000 gallons is considered high volume in the state of Michigan. So it captures quite a range, right? That's a lot of variation. As far as putting it in a model, I mean, my report we're not doing any modeling of that assessment. Maybe Alan could talk about the water assessment tool, but I'm not sure I can address that better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the water assessment tool would take that into account because that calculation has to be run. That doesn't answer the question, however, is the water assessment tool giving an accurate picture of the groundwater in the area?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Manya?
Yeah, so this question comes from Lee Smith from Optimal Value Energy LLC. Do you intend to do a review of best practices used by other states in data-based regulations and transparency for high-volume hydrofracking?
Mm-hmm. So gathering from other states. Sarah?
Yeah, so we are doing a state comparative analysis. We're not doing it on every single legal issue because that would make our report very long. But we are taking sort of some key issues and looking at what states are doing.
I'd also refer folks back to that Resources for the Future study. I believe they did some pretty extensive comparative analyses of regulatory frameworks across states.
They did, and they also have some nice maps that you can look at that give you a quick glance at what states are doing and the variation between regulations in states.
Okay. Maybe one more question, yes.
Coming back to
Yeah.
the trial, if you will.
Coming back and this is more focused toward remediation and maybe aimed more toward Mr. Zolo and across the board, but to what extent will your study be looking at remediation of these sites once the wellheads are closed? Through another company I work with, we've been in discussion with EPA, and one of the directors of EPA is estimated nationwide, they're looking at roughly $1 trillion worth of brownfields types of remediation in the future for fracking sites, currently estimated.
Mm-hmm.
So taking that into account, and some subset of that, of course, will be in Michigan, that's going to be a social cost borne as well as a direct cost to the community, both in jobs for remediating, but also a cost in terms of land put out productive use and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, that gets back to beg the question of to what extent, on the policy side, can you capture those costs up front, even though it be a cost to industry, and requirements to remediate in order to start to issue the site license anyway?
So I think we might be able to take that from a couple of different perspectives. Roland, do you want to? Yeah.
Sure. We do have data on the well closures and the plugging of the wells, and so we will be able to develop an estimate for sort of the jobs involved in taking care of that responsibility that a company has when they exit the well site. As for sort of the larger issue of the social liability, which I think, what happens when you have these many brownfields and how does that affect? That's a larger issue. I see it as dealing with the bonding requirements by the state to make sure that there's insurance to cover any sort of environmental liabilities, long-term environmental liabilities that might accompany that kind of activity. After this session today, I think I have to develop that area of the report. So.
Okay. Anybody else want to address the issue of remediation, either from a regulatory requirement or ecological?
We do just briefly explain the bonding requirements, but I would rely on Roland to do the analysis of what those do.
Yeah, the difficult issue is what exactly is the risk? If you don't know the risk, it's really hard to attach an economic figure to that, right?
Drawing upon what's occurred in other states, you can probably extrapolate from that and gain what the base issue also going to be, what are these companies stiffing the government to remediate
Right.
well down the road from
Right,
our
but the
industry as well as analogous industries.
But the requirements here in this state are much different, and after diving into this topic, it seems sort of assuringly a little bit more restrictive than, say, Pennsylvania. So,
Sure.
It is hard to sort of extrapolate from Pennsylvania, say, to what's going on here. But that's the difficult part. I mean, it would pose it's a challenging question that we can perhaps discuss in general terms, but to put a precise figure on it, I don't think will happen. Certainly not in this phase.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This has been, I think, a good opportunity for us, and I hope we've been able to answer some of your questions about what we're doing and how this is moving forward. Just wanted to direct folks to our website. You can submit a question there anytime. There is a form to do that. We watch those regularly. The way it works is it comes into me, and then if it's for a particular team, I share that with one of the individual faculty members so they can consider that. And we do plan to do additional forums like this in the future as we move forward with this process. So we hope to be probably back in touch with you again sometime around June, where we can share then the final versions of the technical reports, and we'll have those available for public review and comment for a 30-day period. If there's any questions that you have about what we're doing or how we're doing it, I'll be around a little bit after this event, or you can always contact us via the website with the information there, either by phone or email. So thank you very much for joining us, and let's thank our panel for going through all the questions.